Night, November 24th, 1944. Over the western Pacific, a formation of silver giants crawls through the blackness. 4 engines each, the sound a deep metallic growl that shakes the thin air. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the largest and most advanced bomber ever built, is flying its first mission against the Japanese homeland. Inside one of them, Dauntless Dottie, tail number 42-24592. 10 men sit in a narrow pressurized tube, sealed from the freezing void. The cockpit glows faintly green. Oxygen masks hiss. Frost creeps along the window edges. At 25,000 feet, Tokyo is still hundreds of miles away. Below, nothing but black ocean. Above, the moon hides behind cloud. Colonel Robert Morgan, veteran of the Memphis Belle campaign over Europe, grips the control yoke. He's seen flak before, but never this distance, never this isolation. The crew has been airborne for nearly 6 hours from Saipan, one of the newly captured Marianas Islands, a lifeless strip of coral and airfields wrested from the Japanese just months earlier. The Pacific War has reached its final act, and tonight, for the first time, Japan will feel the weight of America's new machine. The interphone crackles. Approaching coast. Radar picking up Tokyo Bay. Morgan leans forward. Through breaks in cloud, faint orange smudges shimmer on the horizon. City lights, small and fragile. The men fall silent. Tokyo, the imperial capital, untouched for 3 years of war, is about to experience what Europe already knows, that the sky itself can become a weapon. The bombardier, Lieutenant Jack Volkert, checks the Norden bomb site, the same technology that promised precision from 30,000 feet. But turbulence buffets the plane. The crosshairs dance. At these altitudes, the jet stream, unknown until these missions, howls at over 150 meters, pushing the bomber off course. Flak bursts bloom outside, black flowers against the clouds. The first shells from Japan's anti-air batteries climb upward, random but growing closer. Bomb bay doors open. Cold air floods the fuselage. The plane shudders. Inside, sweat beads on faces despite the sub-zero air. Tokyo lies below. A vast grid of homes, rail lines, factories. Somewhere amid it, the Musashino aircraft engine works, the mission's target. The light of searchlights sweeps across the clouds. One catches a glint, a silver shape moving slow. Dozens converge, locking on. Morgan exhales. Bombs away. 10,000 pounds of explosives drop into the night, falling for 45 seconds through icy darkness. A heartbeat later, the city blooms in fire. From 30,000 feet, it's only a dull orange pulse. Small, distant, almost silent. But down below, glass shatters, streets erupt. The war reaches the heart of an empire. In 45 seconds, the world has changed. By mid-1944, the Pacific had become an ocean of broken empires. The United States Navy, island by island, had fought its way west, from the coral hell of Tarawa to the volcanic ridges of Saipan. Every step was purchased with thousands of lives and yards of ocean. Yet, the war planners in Washington still faced a brutal truth. Japan, the heart of the enemy, remained untouchable. The distance from the nearest Allied base to Tokyo was over 1,500 miles, beyond the reach of every bomber in service, until now. On runways carved from the volcanic stone of the Mariana Islands, a new aircraft waited. Long, gleaming, and impossibly large. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Each was a flying fortress in the truest sense. 4 Wright R-3350 engines, a pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, and a combat range over 3,000 miles. It could fly higher than any Japanese fighter could climb, carry more than 10 tons of bombs, and cross oceans without refueling. For the men who built it, 60,000 parts, each precision machined in wartime factories. The B-29 was the symbol of American industrial power made flesh and aluminum. But the aircraft was also untested in war. Its engines overheated, its systems failed in the tropics, and its mission, to deliver strategic bombing directly onto the Japanese homeland, demanded logistics on a scale never before attempted. In the summer of 1944, as U.S. Marines secured the Marianas, American engineers followed close behind, turning jungles into airfields. Isley Field, North Field, West Field, names that would soon become synonymous with the fire from the sky. From these islands, the Pacific's vastness finally shrank. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, cities once thought safe behind 1,000 miles of sea, were now within the B-29's grasp. At the center of this new offensive stood Brigadier General Haywood S. Hansel, commander of the freshly formed Wat Ian Farndidi Sittontbeitin Bomber Command. A quiet strategist, believer in the doctrine of precision bombing, Hansel represented the purest vision of air power, that with accuracy, war could be shortened and civilian suffering minimized. He'd learned his trade over Europe, where the 8th Air Force's daylight raids had pulverized Nazi industry. Now he intended to bring that same science of destruction eastward. The mission was as ambitious as it was fragile. Hansel's plan relied on 3 variables rarely kind to aviators: weather, mechanical perfection, and intelligence accuracy. His goal: to strike Japan's aircraft production at its source, crippling the Zero fighter fleet before an invasion became necessary. The first target chosen was the Musashino aircraft engine plant, north of Tokyo, a symbol of Japanese industrial strength and the beating heart of its fighter production. It was the perfect target for the B-29's promise of precision. But Hansel's command faced monumental challenges. Every gallon of aviation fuel, every bomb, every spare part had to be shipped thousands of miles across the Pacific. Every crew member was trained for European conditions, not for the monsoon winds and typhoons of the Western Pacific. And above all, no one yet understood the stratospheric jet streams that swept across Japan, invisible rivers of wind that would toss bombers like leaves and scatter bombs across entire cities. In November 1944, Colonel Robert Morgan's dauntless Dottie led the first formation off Saipan. 49 B-29s followed, engines roaring across the still-new runway. Each carried the same secret weight: 10,000 pounds of bombs, and the hope that this flight could shorten the war. From the moment their wheels lifted, the course of modern warfare had shifted. For the first time in history, a single aircraft could carry a city's destruction across an ocean. They called it Operation San Antonio Fordohaus, the opening move in what the press would soon call the Battle of Tokyo. As the B-29 Superfortresses disappeared into the horizon, their shimmering contrails stretched toward a nation that still believed itself beyond reach. In Tokyo, air raid sirens remained silent. The Imperial War Cabinet had considered the idea of American bombers absurd, a fantasy of propaganda. Japan's military doctrine still assumed the Pacific as its shield, an endless buffer of sea and distance. But distance had just become obsolete. For nearly a decade, Japan's empire had stretched across the Pacific and Asia like a rising tide. From the capture of Manchuria in 1931 to the conquest of Southeast Asia and the Philippines, the Imperial Army had seemed unstoppable. At home, Tokyo was calm, its people disciplined, its streets untouched by the thunder of foreign guns. The war, to most civilians, was something that happened out there, in the jungles of Burma, in the skies over China, or the islands of Micronesia. The Japanese High Command had long assured the emperor that the homeland was beyond the reach of American bombers. The Imperial General Headquarters believed geography itself was their ally. The Pacific Ocean, 5,000 miles wide, was a natural moat, an eternal shield. In 1944, as American submarines cut Japan's supply lines and the U.S. Navy advanced from island to island, Tokyo still projected calm defiance. Official broadcasts spoke of temporary setbacks. Newspapers printed carefully censored victories. Civilians dug shallow air raid trenches in parks, more as a gesture of loyalty than preparation. No one yet imagined that, within months, their wooden city would become kindling. Japan's industrial heart was unlike that of Germany's vast steelworks or America's assembly lines. It was fragmented, woven into the fabric of its cities. Aircraft engines were machined in neighborhood workshops. Bearings, propeller blades, and instruments came from hundreds of small subcontractors scattered through Tokyo's wards. Women worked on lathes beneath their homes. Children carried parts between factories. Destroying Japan's war machine would mean destroying its cities themselves, a reality not yet grasped in Washington, nor fully accepted in Tokyo. The first glimmer of danger came that summer when Mariana Islands fell. Japanese officers, studying captured maps, understood the implication instantly. From Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the Americans could reach Tokyo with a new, unknown type of bomber. They reported this to their superiors, but the warnings were met with disbelief. "Impossible," one staff officer said. "No aircraft can fly that far and return." Japan's defense network had been built on that assumption. Radar coverage was limited, early warning minimal. The Air Defense Command had fewer than 2,000 fighters to cover the entire archipelago, many obsolete or grounded by lack of fuel. Anti-aircraft guns ringed key factories, but ammunition was scarce and radar direction unreliable. To counter a threat no one believed possible, Japan relied on faith, loyalty, and the illusion of distance. As the Americans prepared on Saipan, life in Tokyo continued in its strange normality. Streetcars clattered past Imperial Palace walls. Women queued for rice. The sky above remained serene, unbroken, except for Japanese training aircraft circling over distant bases. Yet, quietly, anxiety crept in. Families near military plants built crude shelters from planks and sandbags. Schoolchildren practiced evacuation drills, instructed to flee with wet towels over their heads. At night, civil defense wardens patrolled streets to enforce blackout regulations, though most lamps still burned softly behind shoji screens. The government told citizens that American bombers, if they came, would be intercepted long before reaching the capital. The propaganda leaflets, printed in bold kanji, promised, "Our skies are secure under the Emperor's protection." But not even the Emperor's protection could stop what was coming. Far away, in the Marianas, the airfields grew crowded with silver wings. Each morning, hundreds of ground crews fueled, armed, and serviced the new giants. Pilots studied meteorological reports, the first to record the strange high-altitude winds that would later scatter bombs across entire cities. In the command tents, maps of Japan hung on plywood walls, red circles marking future targets: Musashino, Nagoya, Yokohama, Kawasaki, Osaka. The air war that had ravaged Europe was about to be reborn over Asia, on a scale the world had never seen. For Japan, the illusion of invincibility was about to end in a single night. When dauntless Dati crossed the shoreline north of Tokyo in the early hours of November 24, 1944, the air raid sirens screamed for the first time in the capital since the great Kanto earthquake drills of the 1920s. It was the sound of a new kind of war, the echo of distance collapsing. The final months of 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces believed they had found the key to ending the war without an invasion. That key was precision. From the first days of the conflict, air power theorists like General Henry Hap, Arnold and the disciples of the Air Corps Tactical School had argued that wars could be won by destroying a nation's ability to fight, not by slaughtering its armies, but by breaking the machine that sustained them. Factories, power stations, rail hubs, strike those with mathematical precision, and the rest would collapse in silence. Europe had been their laboratory. Over the skies of Germany, formations of B-17s and B-24s had flown daylight raids guided by the Norden bomb sight, a gyroscopic optical computer said to be so accurate that it could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. The doctrine became a creed. Precision, not terror, would end wars faster and more humanely. Now, in the Pacific, General Arnold intended to prove it. The new B-29 Bomber Command under Brigadier General Haywood Hansel was more than a combat unit. It was a scientific experiment with engines. Hansel's orders from Washington were clear: destroy Japan's aircraft industry through high-altitude, daylight, precision attacks. The campaign would cripple Japan's ability to defend itself and force surrender by air alone. Every variable had been calculated. Altitude, 30,000 feet above flak and fighters. Formation, tight boxes for mutual defense. Timing, daylight for visibility. Weather, clear skies over targets. Accuracy, the Norden would ensure it. Each mission plan was written like an equation. If all the numbers held, victory was inevitable. But the Pacific was not Europe. The distances were longer, the weather more volatile, the enemy more elusive. Yet, on paper, it all seemed elegant, clinical, a war of geometry. To support the plan, the Americans had built a logistical miracle. From California to the Marianas, convoys of tankers, freighters, and troop ships ferried every ounce of fuel, bomb, and spare part across the largest ocean on Earth. By the fall of 1944, the islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam had transformed into a vast aerial city. Runways 4 miles long, steel hangars gleaming under tropical sun, and control towers humming with Morse code chatter. Each B-29 required 1,000 man-hours of maintenance for every mission. Mechanics worked around the clock under floodlights, swatting mosquitoes and wiping sweat from aluminum skin. The smell of oil and avgas clung to everything. From these islands, the bombers could reach not only Tokyo, but every major city on Honshu. The Pacific had become a runway aimed directly at Japan's heart. For Hansel and his airmen, this was a crusade of precision. The belief that technology could make war rational. He told his crews, "We will not bomb homes. We will bomb the machine that builds the homes of war." The target list reflected that philosophy. Aircraft plants, arsenals, engine factories, and shipyards, each carefully plotted on maps derived from pre-war surveys and reconnaissance photos. The first strike, Operation San Antonio Front, would prove the concept. The target, the Musashino aircraft engine works, a vital part of the Nakajima complex producing engines for the Ki-84 Frank and the Zero fighter. Destroy Musashino, and Japan's air power would wither. The plan called for 111 aircraft. Only 88 reached takeoff readiness. Mechanical failures grounded others before the mission began, an early sign of how fragile the system was. Still, optimism reigned. American newspapers were already printing headlines about the B-29s over Tokyo. The public believed the war was entering its final act. On the maps spread across briefing tables, red lines arced cleanly from the Marianas to Tokyo and back again. 3,000 miles of perfect geometry. In reality, those lines crossed storms, winds, and darkness no pencil could capture. But the crews didn't know that yet. They believed in their machines, in their training, in the logic of the plan. The war, after all, had always rewarded those who believed in their own precision. Before dawn on November 24, 1944, the first wave of B-29s thundered off the runways of Saipan. The air was heavy with exhaust and salt, the smell of aviation fuel thick enough to taste. Crews strapped in with ritual precision. Maps folded, oxygen checked, flak vests in place. As each bomber rose, their silver wings caught the moonlight, turning the horizon into a slow-moving constellation of war. From the ground, it looked flawless. From the sky, everything began to fall apart. Within an hour, the mission's clean geometry dissolved into turbulence and error. Engines overheated in the humid air. Some burst into flame on climb-out. Others simply lost oil pressure, their pilots forced to turn back before even reaching cruising altitude. The R-3350 duplex Cyclone engine, a masterpiece of power on paper, was a nightmare in the tropics. Its cooling fins cracked, its cylinders warped. Mechanics called it the fire-prone heart of the Superfortress. Every flight risked combustion. Of the 90 aircraft that took off, 17 turned back within the first few hundred miles. For those that pressed on, another enemy awaited: the jet stream. At 30,000 feet, over the northern Pacific, the air moved faster than any aviator had ever measured. Winds of more than 150 miles per hour. No one in the U.S. Army Air Forces had known such currents existed. They slammed into the B-29 formations with invisible fists, blowing them off course by tens of miles. Bombardiers peering through their Norden sights found their targets racing sideways across the crosshairs. The bomb site's perfect mathematics had no answer for chaos. It was like trying to bomb from a moving train into another moving train, one pilot later recalled. Then came the clouds. The weather reports, based on sparse ship data, had promised clear skies. Instead, over Tokyo, a thick overcast spread from horizon to horizon. The Musashino plant, the operation's single, carefully chosen target, vanished beneath a gray lid of vapor. Hansel's doctrine demanded visual identification before dropping, but with visibility near zero, crews were forced to choose: turn back with their payloads or bomb through cloud by radar, a system still experimental and imprecise. Most chose the latter. Their bomb runs, scattered by wind and obscured by fog, sent high-explosive payloads falling miles from their intended mark. Some landed on rice paddies, others in residential wards. The raid that was meant to demonstrate precision instead became an early lesson in its impossibility. Even reaching the target area was a trial. Navigation equipment malfunctioned in the magnetic distortions of the upper atmosphere. One formation veered 50 miles off course. Another bombed a decoy site northwest of the city. A few aircraft, confused by clouds and radio silence, circled aimlessly until fuel forced them homeward. Meanwhile, Japanese defenses, though limited, were alert. Radar operators on Honshu picked up the approaching bombers long before they reached Tokyo Bay. Searchlights stabbed upward through the clouds, followed by flak bursts, erratic but deadly enough. In the glow of tracer fire, crews glimpsed the faint outlines of Japanese fighters clawing toward them. Kai-45 Toryu Nick interceptors, climbing desperately to reach the intruders. At those altitudes, few could. The B-29s flew too high, too fast. But the flak found its mark. Several aircraft were hit. One exploded mid-air, another limped out to sea trailing fire. By the time the surviving bombers turned for home, precision had given way to survival. Fuel gauges sank toward empty. Crewmen rotated through the turrets, scanning for fighters that rarely appeared. The sky was a blur of exhaustion and static. One radio operator later wrote, "We didn't feel triumphant. We just felt small. The sky was too big, and the war was too far from over." When they finally returned to Saipan, their bomb bays empty and engines rattling, Hansel gathered the reports. The results were devastating, but not for Japan. Only a fraction of the bombs had struck the intended target. Damage to the Musashino factory was minimal. The promise of precision bombing, the idea that technology could make war surgical, had failed its first real test. And yet, the men would go again. Because plans can fail, but momentum never stops. Dawn came early on 24th November 1944. On Isley Field, Saipan, the ground trembled beneath 4 dozen giant propellers. Mechanics in oil-stained fatigues tightened bolts one last time, fuel trucks hissed, and the air smelled of avgas and salt. This was Operation San Antonio Vow, the first American strike on Tokyo since Doolittle's daring raid more than 2 years earlier. But this time it was no symbolic dash. This was the opening of a campaign designed to crush Japan's industrial lungs. At 5 a.m., Colonel Robert Morgan climbed into the left seat of B-29, dauntless Dottie. Around him, 1-10 bombers waited on parallel runways, each loaded with nearly 10,000 pounds of explosives. Every takeoff was a gamble. Each Superfortress weighed more than any plane that had ever flown into combat, and Saipan's coral runways left little room for error. Engines roared one by one. Dust and exhaust cloaked the field. Observers on the ridge saw the first bomber lift, barely clearing the palms, and vanish toward the horizon. Behind it, others followed in 30-second intervals, a procession of silver leviathans climbing into the haze. Inside the fuselages, the temperature dropped sharply. At altitude, the Pacific turned to steel below them. 10 men per plane, each sealed into a narrow pressurized tube. Pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, gunners. Oxygen masks hissed. Radios cracked with Morse bursts. Through the cockpit windows, morning sunlight flashed across endless ocean. 6 hours of monotony and tension stretched ahead. Fuel gauges ticked down imperceptibly. The men rationed coffee from thermos cups and scanned the instruments. Navigation meant dead reckoning across 1,000 miles of open water. If anything went wrong, engine failure, fire, loss of pressure. There was no rescue, only the sea. At 30,000 feet, the first signs of weather arrived. Wisps of cirrus. The outer fingers of the jet stream no one yet understood. The planes drifted. Formation discipline began to erode. Crews corrected course constantly, following the leader's position by guess and gyro compass. Hours later, Japan appeared as a smudge on radar scopes, the curved edge of Honshu rising from the dark. The interphone crackled, coastline in sight, switching to combat oxygen. In the forward cabin, the bombardier, Lieutenant Jack Volkert, leaned over the Norden bomb site. Below them stretched Tokyo Bay, veiled in cloud and mist. To their left, the faint gleam of the Chiba Peninsula. Ahead, the sprawl of the world's largest wooden city. Searchlights waited. Flak guns waited. And 13 million civilians who believed their city untouchable waited, unknowing. The first explosion came not from Tokyo, but from the sky itself. A flak burst, a black blossom of smoke, erupted just below the leading bomber. Fragments ripped through the air with the sound of gravel in a furnace. Another burst, then another, and suddenly the night was alive with invisible teeth. Dauntless Dottie lurched. Morgan steadied her with both hands. In the tail, the gunner swore into his mask, watching tracers claw toward them. Outside, the sky bloomed with black and orange puffs, hundreds rising in mechanical rhythm from guns ringing the capital. Below the clouds, Tokyo's anti-aircraft network threw everything it had. Batteries at Tachikawa, Yokosuka, and Musashino fired blindly into overcast. Most shells burst hundreds of feet too low, but a few reached the bomber's altitude. Each concussion rocked aluminum frames already strained by cold and wind. Japanese radar operators shouted bearing and range. Fighter squadrons scrambled from Atsugi and Yokota fields. But the interceptors, mostly Kai-45 Toryu and Kai-61 Heian, could barely reach 28,000 feet before engines gasped. They fired sporadically, tracers arcing like fireflies into the darkness. The B-29s held course, nearly unopposed. Through cloud gaps, faint lights glimmered. The grid of the capital itself. The bombardier toggled the Norden. Crosshairs wobbled across smudged shapes. Wind drift corrections scrawled across his clipboard. 150 miles from the west. At that speed, bombs would scatter miles off target. But protocol demanded release. Bomb bay doors open. Metal yawned. Cold rushed in, slicing through flight suits. Below, nothing but storm and light. Steady, steady. Bombs away. 10,000 pounds of high explosive fell through cloud, each canister spinning end over end, invisible until the moment of impact. 45 seconds later, Tokyo felt the sound. The air raid sirens screamed first, thin and distant, then multiplied until every ward echoed with them. For most civilians, it was the first true alarm of the war. Few had practiced what to do. Over Omiya and Musashino, where factories shared space with rows of small homes, the earth convulsed. Bombs meant for machine shops tore through roof lines, detonating in courtyards and tram depots. Shockwaves folded wooden houses like paper screens. In central wards, fragments from high-explosive clusters punched through windows. Gas mains burst and fed new fires. People ran, dazed, clutching futons, photographs, anything they could carry. At a schoolyard near Nakano, students on night watch saw a column of flame rise beyond the trees and thought an ammunition depot had exploded. They were wrong. It was a line of family homes igniting in sequence. Japanese firefighters responded within minutes, but pumps failed as mains cracked. They fought flames with sand and buckets, their silhouettes flickering against walls of orange. The night smelled of pine smoke, oil, and burning tatami. One woman later wrote, "It was as if the wind itself burned. The air was fire." Yet compared to what would come later in 1945, this was a small taste. A prelude. From above, the men saw little of that chaos. To them, the city appeared as a restless glow beneath clouds. Bomb runs finished. The crews turned for home. Radio discipline was tight. Chatter was minimal. Each man knew fuel margins were razor-thin. Dottie descended slightly to escape headwinds. In the tail, the gunner spotted streaks of tracers. Japanese fighters giving futile chase before falling back into darkness. For all the flak, only one B-29 failed to return that night. As dawn rose over the Pacific, the surviving aircraft limped home to Saipan, paint blistered, wings streaked with oil. Crewmen staggered onto coral runways, eyes red, hands trembling from cold and adrenaline. They had flown 3,000 miles in 16 hours, the longest bombing mission in history to that point. In the debriefing tents, intelligence officers gathered reports. Each crew gave a version of the same story. Clouds, wind, target lost, bombs dropped by radar. Film from strike cameras confirmed it. Most payloads had missed Musashino entirely. Factories bore light damage. Production would recover within days. The mission had proved the B-29's reach, not its precision. For General Hansel, it was a bitter irony. The first strike meant to validate daylight accuracy instead showed its futility against weather and wind. When morning broke over the capital, smoke still drifted above the suburbs. Hundreds were dead or wounded. Rail lines lay twisted, workshops smashed, rows of homes flattened. Yet the city still functioned. Trains ran by noon, and workers returned to sweep debris from factory floors. Japanese radio announced a minor raid repelled by our brave airmen. In truth, only a few fighters had even engaged. But the psychological tremor was immense. For the first time, the citizens of Tokyo understood that the war had come home. They had seen American bombers, heard their engines, felt their thunder. Distance was no longer defense. At the Imperial Palace, military aides reported to Prime Minister Koiso that the enemy had reached the capital by new aircraft of extraordinary range. The Emperor was informed that evening, listening in silence as aides described the damage. He asked one question: "Is it certain they came from Saipan?" When told yes, he nodded once and said nothing more. On Saipan, the airmen ate in silence. The mess tent reeked of sweat and gasoline. One gunner scrawled a note in his logbook: "Hit something, but not what we aimed for." The words captured the truth of the entire mission. Hansel filed his report to Washington. Mission executed as planned. Bombing results unsatisfactory due to overcast and strong winds. Enemy resistance moderate. Aircraft losses minimal. The language was clinical, the meaning unmistakable. Precision had failed. Still, the effect was strategic. Japan now knew the United States could reach its heart at will. The B-29 had proven its endurance. Only its method would change. Within weeks, Hansel's replacement, General Curtis LeMay, would arrive with a new philosophy. Forget high-altitude precision. Strike low, strike by night. Burn everything that burns. But that would come later. For now, the men of dauntless Dottie had returned alive, the first to drop 10,000 pounds of explosives on Tokyo and return to tell it. They were exhausted, triumphant, and quietly aware that their war had just crossed an invisible moral line. As the last engines cooled and the Pacific night settled over Saipan, a simple truth hung in the air. The fortress could reach the city, and the city had no answer. When the last of the B-29s rolled to a stop on Saipan, the island exhaled as if it too had been holding its breath. The ground crews, who had watched the departure with pride and fear, now counted the planes as they returned. One by one they appeared, oil-streaked, dented, streaked with salt, each crew exhausted, each tail number a small miracle. Of the 111 superfortresses dispatched, 88 had reached the target area. 17 turned back with engine fires or mechanical failures before reaching Honshu. One never returned at all. It was found weeks later, wreckage scattered in the Philippine Sea. By the arithmetic of war, the loss rate was small, barely 1%. But behind each number lay men who had vanished into silence. The first daylight photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft the next morning told a story very different from the optimistic press reports. The Musashino engine works, the operation's aiming point, stood largely intact. A few roof panels peeled away, several machine shops scorched, but production could resume within days. Analysts estimated less than 5% damage to the main plant. The bombs had fallen miles wide, scattered by winds the planners had never considered. The majority struck the surrounding suburbs, Omiya, Tachikawa, and the industrial wards north of central Tokyo. Several small component workshops were flattened. Hundreds of homes burned. American analysts later called it light collateral damage. In Tokyo, it felt anything but light. Japanese authorities recorded 400 killed, nearly 500 wounded, and 50,000 square meters of factory floor destroyed or disabled. Rail lines were cut in several places, causing temporary transport chaos. The imperial press downplayed the figures, calling it an enemy nuisance attack. But privately, the Home Ministry warned that the capital was now exposed to destruction beyond imagination if such raids continued. Materially, the raid achieved little. Psychologically, it was an earthquake. For 3 years, Japan's citizens had lived under the illusion that the ocean would keep them safe. Now, in a single morning, that illusion dissolved. In the wards closest to the blast, survivors gathered before dawn amid ash and broken glass. Children pointed to the sky. asking what the roaring monsters had been. Teachers had no answer. That day, the civil defense offices were overwhelmed with requests for sandbags, water pumps, and air raid drills. Tokyo's mayor ordered a review of evacuation plans. Newspapers printed diagrams teaching families how to dig fire trenches in their courtyards. In Washington, those same images were studied under magnifying lenses. To the analysts of the 20th Air Force, the mission's imperfections were lessons, not defeats. They had proved the aircraft's range and the vulnerability of Japan's air defenses. They now sought to refine their methods. New bombs, better weather data, perhaps radar guidance. Precision had failed, but the machine had reached its mark. The heart of Japan. The toll was not only mechanical. Crewmen returned pale and trembling. One gunner from the 498th Group described sitting in silence after landing, unable to remove his gloves. Another wrote in his diary, "It was not the bombs, it was the waiting. The feeling that the air itself might break us." Frostbite, oxygen deprivation, and fatigue plagued the crews. The round trip to Tokyo and back lasted up to 16 hours, the longest combat mission ever flown at that time. Several aircraft landed with tanks dry, coasting onto runways on fumes. In their debriefings, many airmen admitted they never actually saw the target. They dropped on radar or on lead, trusting instruments rather than eyes. It gnawed at them, the distance between intention and impact. Back in the Marianas, General Hansel received the reconnaissance photos in silence. The results were undeniable. Minimal industrial damage, moderate civilian destruction, valuable lessons on jet stream winds. He knew what Washington would say. Change tactics. But for that moment, he stood by his creed. Precision, he insisted, was still the path to victory, just not yet perfected. The truth was harder. Technology could bridge oceans but not weather, could promise accuracy but not deliver it. The first raid on Tokyo had demonstrated both mankind's greatest reach and its oldest limitation. And beneath the headlines and communiques, the Pacific wind still carried the smell of smoke from Musashino's suburbs, a reminder that every experiment in precision has a human cost. The night after the raid, Tokyo did not sleep. The fires were out, but the air still tasted of cinders and cordite. From the burned wards around Musashino, lines of evacuees stretched toward the city's edge. Mothers carrying bundles, children clutching hands, faces lit by the orange afterglow. For many, it was the first glimpse of what the war truly meant. Newspapers the next morning printed only a few lines. Enemy aircraft raided the Tokyo area. Damage under investigation. Situation under control. But rumors filled the silence. People whispered of hundreds dead, of homes flattened, of the emperor's palace nearly struck. In markets and tram stops, ordinary citizens looked up when they heard the distant drone of engines, half expecting the sky to open again. The illusion of distance, the belief that Japan's heart was unreachable, had died in those 45 seconds of falling bombs. By official count, roughly 400 civilians were killed, nearly 500 injured, and thousands left homeless. Hospitals overflowed with burn victims. Teachers led children to school the next morning, only to find classrooms full of smoke. The government promised swift reconstruction and doubled the air raid drills in Tokyo and Yokohama. In private, civil defense chiefs reported grim realities. Fire breaks were inadequate, pumps obsolete, shelters shallow. Tokyo, built of wood, paper, and faith, was a city made to burn. And though most citizens did not yet know it, this first raid was only a whisper of what would follow. On Saipan, dawn brought celebration tempered by fatigue. Ground crews cheered each plane that returned intact. Officers posed beside the B-29s for photographs to send home. The first revenge for Pearl Harbor. Yet among the crews, the mood was somber. They had seen the clouds swallow their target, had felt the engines stutter, had watched bombs vanish into vapor with no sense of where they fell. In the debrief tents, mission summaries read like confessions. No visual target. Bombed through cloud. Accuracy unknown. For many, it was their first confrontation with the gap between war's promise and its practice. A gunner from the 73rd Bomb Wing wrote in his log, "They told us we'd hit a factory, but I think we hit houses. I keep seeing roofs where I expected steel." Fatigue lined every face. The mission had lasted 16 hours. Some crews had flown 20 with diversions and headwinds. 3 men were carried from aircraft on stretchers, unconscious from oxygen starvation. Others wept quietly in the darkness outside the briefing huts. The cost of one raid reached staggering numbers even before counting lives. Each B-29 consumed over 7,000 gallons of fuel. Each bomb load demanded a chain of ships and tankers stretching from California to Saipan. Mechanics tore down half the engines that week, replacing pistons scorched by tropical heat. Every mission would cost millions of dollars in 1944 currency. An entire town's worth of metal and manpower spent in a single night. But cost was never the question. Reach was, and now America could reach Tokyo whenever it chose. For Brigadier General Haywood Hansell, the aftermath was both triumph and torment. He had proved that the B-29 could strike Japan. Yet, it had failed to prove that bombing could remain precise. Reports showed 90% of bombs missed their intended point. To Washington, this meant change. To Hansell, it meant doubt. He reread his own directive: to destroy Japan's war potential with minimal harm to non-combatants. But that night's flames had already blurred the line between combatant and civilian. Far from Tokyo, his peers debated a harsher logic. General Loris Norstad, Arnold's operations chief, cabled that if weather and altitude defeated accuracy, the alternative is low altitude and incendiaries. The shift had begun, from science to fire. At Imperial General Headquarters, the mood turned grim. Intelligence officers confirmed that the bombers had come from the Marianas, proof that Japan's defensive perimeter was broken. Army Minister General Anami Korichika demanded new tactics: dispersal of factories, camouflage, night fighter training. But the resources no longer existed. Fuel was vanishing, and radar production lagged months behind need. To ordinary citizens, these were distant words. They buried the dead, patched roofs, and kept working. The war had grown close, but life, astonishingly, continued. Streetcars ran, rice was rationed, and school children practiced bucket brigades with laughter that sounded almost normal. When the reconnaissance photographs reached Washington, they were studied not for tragedy but for data: altitude effects, wind scatter, bomb pattern density. To the planners, Tokyo was now a test site. The lessons would feed into new tactics: lower altitudes, incendiary loads, radar targeting, culminating months later in the firebombing campaigns that would erase entire districts. But on that November day, none of the airmen knew they had opened a door that could never close. They thought they were striking at machines. Instead, they had struck at the boundary between technology and humanity. The cost was not only counted in bodies or buildings, but in certainty. From now on, every man who flew, every citizen who listened for engines in the night, understood. Modern war no longer had a front line. The first raid on Tokyo had proven one thing beyond doubt: the United States could reach Japan's capital. Everything else, accuracy, efficiency, morality, was suddenly in question. In Washington, the cables from the Marianas were read without sentiment. Results unsatisfactory due to weather and high-altitude winds. In one sentence, the dream of precision collapsed under the physics of the upper atmosphere. Jet stream winds of more than 150 miles per hour had scattered bomb patterns over miles. No bomb site, no matter how ingenious, could compensate. For the engineers and planners who had staked their reputations on surgical warfare, the conclusion was brutal. The machine had outpaced the doctrine. The B-29 could reach anywhere on Earth, but it could not aim through cloud, wind, or chance. On Saipan, Brigadier General Haywood Hansel faced that reality in silence. His faith in daylight precision, in the idea that an air campaign could cripple war production without mass killing, was sincere, even moral. But the reports from the first month of operations told a single story. Huge effort, minimal results. Between November and January, 21 major missions struck industrial targets in Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. Fewer than 10% of bombs hit within 1,000 feet of their aim points. Weather closed targets half the time. Mechanical attrition devoured aircraft before they left the ground. Every gallon of fuel, every hour of flight, became an argument for change. Hansel argued for patience, better radar, improved jet stream forecasts, incremental accuracy. His superiors argued for effect. At the headquarters of the 20th Air Force, General Loris Norstad cabled, "If high-altitude precision fails, we must consider low-level incendiary attacks. The enemy's cities are his war industry." Hansel resisted. He believed such tactics betrayed the moral foundation of American air power. But war is impatient with ideals. By January 1945, General Curtis E. LeMay arrived on Guam to take command. Hansel was relieved with polite ceremony and a handshake. The new commander carried a different creed. Results measured in square miles. LeMay's philosophy was pure pragmatism. He studied the reconnaissance photos, the sprawling wooden neighborhoods that housed Japan's workshops, and saw not scattered targets, but fuel. He concluded that Japan's industrial network was inseparable from its cities. Destroy the cities, and the network would die with them. The doctrine shifted overnight. High-altitude daylight raids gave way to low-altitude night firebombing. The B-29s, stripped of most defensive guns to carry more incendiaries, would fly at $5,000 to 7,000 feet, beneath radar, guided by new Pathfinder systems. Instead of 10,000-pound precision loads, they would drop rivers of jellied gasoline and magnesium bomblets. The Superfortress became a torch-bearer. The experiment began on 9th of March 1945, the infamous fire raid on Tokyo. In 6 hours, 279 B-29s dropped nearly 500,000 incendiary cylinders. The resulting inferno destroyed 16 square miles, killed over 100,000 people, and left 1 million homeless. What began as Hansel's scientific war had become LeMay's conflagration. The lesson from November 1944, that precision was an illusion, had been taken to its logical, terrible conclusion. The shift transformed the Pacific Air War. Production in Japan collapsed. Aircraft output fell by half, shipping by 2/3, power generation by 40%. Rail hubs melted. Communications faltered. The incendiary campaign consumed 64 major cities before the atomic bomb ever flew. By summer 1945, Japan's urban core was a lattice of ashes. Militarily, the success was undeniable. Strategically, it set a precedent that would haunt the century. For the first time, the destruction of a civilian population was justified as the most efficient route to peace. At Potsdam and later Tokyo Bay, Allied commanders cited the bombing campaign as the force that made Japan's surrender inevitable. The invasion, planners claimed, might have cost 1 million Allied lives. Yet among the architects of the new air power, a quieter unease lingered. Precision had been abandoned, and with it, the moral distinction that had once separated strategy from vengeance. After the war, when the smoke cleared and tribunals convened, the question surfaced: had the firebombing of cities been lawful? Under the Hague Conventions of 1907, attacks on undefended towns were prohibited. Yet Tokyo had been defended, and its industry interwoven with homes. There were no clear statutes for aerial war. At the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, 1946–48, Japanese prosecutors attempted to raise the issue. American judges dismissed it. The victors wrote the verdicts. Legality followed victory. No Allied officer was ever charged for strategic bombing. LeMay himself would later remark, "If we had lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals. But we didn't." That candor, brutal in its simplicity, became the war's legal epitaph. In the decades that followed, the lessons of the B-29 campaign hardened into doctrine. The idea of air power as an independent, decisive arm was proven, but so was its moral volatility. From Korea to Vietnam to the Gulf, commanders cited the precedent of 1945, the belief that air superiority could compel surrender. Each conflict revisited the same paradox born over Tokyo, that the line between military and civilian, between target and tragedy, is perilously thin. The first Tokyo raid, the one that lasted only 45 seconds of falling bombs, had been a failure in tactics but a success in evolution. It set in motion every argument that would define modern warfare. How far can technology excuse destruction? Can precision ever be moral if it fails? Does victory sanctify the method? By war's end, the numbers spoke with cold authority. 160,000 tons of bombs dropped on Japan, 331 civilian deaths from conventional bombing, 64 cities destroyed before the atomic missions, a strategic success achieved at the price of ethical certainty. For historians, the causal chain begins not with Hiroshima, but with that first raid in November 1944. When the B-29s returned from Musashino, streaked with frost and failure, they carried the seed of the future. The recognition that when precision falters, fire replaces it. The legal world never fully caught up with that truth. The moral world still hasn't. When the guns fell silent in August 1945, the war's final images were of cities turned to powder and of a single aircraft releasing a weapon that dwarfed every earlier explosion. Yet the path to that moment began not at Hiroshima, but months earlier in the cold sky above Tokyo, when one B-29, seeking precision, revealed its impossibility. The first raid had been small by later standards, 45 seconds of falling steel, but its consequences rippled through every decision that followed. It proved that the United States could strike the Japanese homeland at will, and that technology, however sophisticated, could not conquer weather, wind, or chance. From that revelation grew a new faith, not in accuracy, but in overwhelming power. The B-29 Superfortress was more than a bomber. It was the prototype for the age of global reach. Its pressurized cabin, remote gun turrets, and radar bombing systems became the architecture of post-war flight. From its lineage came the B-50, the B-47 Stratojet, the B-52, and eventually the platforms that would carry nuclear weapons around the planet. Every button, every bomb bay, carried the memory of those first missions from Saipan. In the laboratories of Boeing and Wright Field, engineers dissected the Tokyo raids as data sets. Temperature profiles, fuel curves, failure rates. From human struggle came technical evolution. The jet stream that had scattered bombs in 1944 would, by 1949, guide commercial pilots across the Pacific. The winds that confounded war became the arteries of peace. But technology does not choose its purpose. Men do. In the new world divided between East and West, the air power theories tested over Japan hardened into doctrine. The Strategic Air Command, founded under General LeMay, inherited both the machinery and the mindset of the B-29 campaign. Its creed was simple: destruction on demand. Nuclear deterrence was merely the next step in the logic of total reach. Training films spoke of pinpoint delivery, echoing Hansel's old faith in precision. But now the payload was atomic, and a miss of 500 meters meant a city instead of a factory. The language of the Musashino raid, effective radius, probability of hit, collateral zone, became the lexicon of the nuclear age. The gap between intention and consequence remained. Only the scale changed. In Tokyo, memory took a different form. For decades after the war, survivors of the early raids were overshadowed by the inferno of March 1945 and by Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yet among them lingered the recollection of that first alarm. The moment the sirens broke 3 years of silence. Museums in Musashino and Omiya still display fragments of shrapnel from November 1944, labeled simply First Air Raid. Visitors walk past them quickly, unaware that those fragments mark the first crossing of an ethical frontier. Japanese historians later called that night the opening of the burning sky. It was when the homeland realized that distance, devotion and discipline could not shield it from the new logic of warfare, the logic of altitude. After the war, films and newsreels romanticized the Norden bomb site and the heroism of the bomber crews. Pickle-barrel accuracy, they claimed. But the combat records told a harsher story. At 30,000 feet, even in perfect weather, half of all bombs missed by more than half a mile. Precision had been an ideal, not a fact. That ideal, however, remains seductive. In every generation since, from Korea to Kosovo, leaders have promised surgical strikes, smart bombs, collateral-free warfare. Each promise echoes the same belief Hansel once carried into the Pacific night, that technology can make war humane. Each war reminds us that it cannot. Precision is not morality. It is only aim. For Robert Morgan and his crew, the men of Dauntless Dottie, the mission became a lifetime memory, a mixture of pride and unease. Morgan returned home a national hero, yet rarely spoke of Tokyo. He later said, "You can hit a target and still miss the point." Hansel died decades later, convinced that he had been right too soon, that someday, with better tools, precision could spare civilians. LeMay, his successor, believed the opposite, that fear ends wars faster than accuracy. Both men were, in their own ways, products of the same night over Tokyo. One sought perfection, the other, conclusion. Their debate between principle and pragmatism remains. The Airman's Inheritance. Plan. Today, through the neighborhoods of Western Tokyo, and you will find no trace of the Musashino engine plant. Apartment blocks and train stations stand where workshops once hummed. Children play under trees planted during the city's post-war reconstruction, unaware that the soil beneath them once held fragments of American steel. Yet above those streets, every commercial jet that arcs toward Narita or Haneda follows the same corridor first carved by the B-29s in 1944. The sky remembers. For the world that emerged from that conflict, the legacy was double-edged. The same mastery of distance that once delivered destruction now connects continents in hours. The same metallurgy that built bombers builds pressurized cabins for tourists. Every piece carries the fingerprints of its war. History rarely offers clarity, but this battle did. It taught that reach without restraint changes the nature of war. That technology magnifies both intention and error, and that moral distance grows with altitude. From Saipan's runways to Tokyo's firelit horizon, the lesson is written in vapor and ash. Precision is not the same as conscience. Machines can deliver the bomb. Only men decide why. The Japanese never expected that a single aircraft could drop 10,000 pounds of explosives and vanish into the clouds in 45 seconds. The world never expected how easily that act would become normal. In that gap between surprise and acceptance lies the true legacy of the B-29. Some myths about Tokyo raid are myth 1. The first Tokyo raid devastated the capital. Fact, it did not. The 24th November 1944 strike burned a few factory blocks and nearby homes, but left the Musashino engine works, its true target, mostly operational. Less than 5% of its floor space was damaged. Repairs began within days. Yet newspapers in the United States hailed a smashing blow, while Japanese propaganda called it a repelled nuisance. Both were exaggerations. The raid's real importance was not destruction, but discovery. The revelation that Japan could be reached, and that precision could fail. Myth 2. Japan was defenseless. Fact: Tokyo bristled with anti-aircraft batteries and fighter bases at Atsugi, Tachikawa, and Yokota. Its radar network, though primitive, tracked the B-29s from the coast. What doomed the defense was not weakness, but altitude and physics. The bombers flew too high, too far, and too fast for most interceptors to climb. Japan was not unarmed. It was out-engineered. Myth 3. The B-29 campaign was instantly effective. Fact: It took 4 months of trial and error before results improved. High-altitude bombing scattered munitions across miles of countryside until LeMay's low-level incendiary raids in March 1945 finally inflicted strategic paralysis. The early missions were not victories but laboratories, where airmen learned, often through tragedy, how vast the distance was between theory and outcome. Myth 4. The crews were detached, mechanical killers. Fact: Many returned shaken. Diaries speak of frostbite, fear, and the haunting sight of city lights disappearing beneath cloud. They did not see themselves as executioners. They were technicians inside a system whose scale exceeded human grasp. Their courage was real, but so was their doubt. War creates stories faster than it creates truth. Myth comforts, fact unsettles, but only truth endures. The first raid on Tokyo was neither triumph nor atrocity. It was a beginning, a single experiment that exposed the limits of precision and the boundlessness of consequence. From that night forward, every hum of engines over a sleeping city would carry its echo. History remembers the flash. Memory must remember the moment before it. The quiet decision to open the bomb bay doors, believing that knowledge could make war clean. It never has.